Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Erin O'Brien. I'm the Policy Programs Director for Wisconsin Wetlands Association, and I am your facilitator today. Welcome back for those of you that attended part one of this series in December, and welcome to anyone who's new. We're going to do a little review to catch everybody up. So our topic today, hydrology basics and the development of Wisconsin's landscapes. I'd like to start with a couple of quick acknowledgements, if my slides would advance. There we go. The program here is brought to you as part of a collaboration between Wisconsin Wetlands Association and the Department of Agricultural Trade and Consumer Protection with funding from EPA. And I'd also like to thank Wisconsin Land+Water for their assistance in promoting these webinars and some assistance with curriculum development. And also because after we end today, a recording of this session, please note it is being recorded, will be posted on their training website, and we will send that link around. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit, maybe just 5 minutes or so, on why we're here, what we're trying to accomplish. So this webinar is part of a pilot training series that we've been developing collaboratively, again, with DADCAP, to develop and deliver a core curriculum on hydrologic assessment. And our objectives are to help learners evaluate how upstream hydrologic conditions can affect downstream resource concerns, so all the problems you all are trying to solve. We're looking, this is part of many activities we're doing as an organization to help increase consideration of hydrologic restoration as a soil and water conservation practice. And most importantly, as importantly, because this is a pilot, we are looking to gather data and input to help us refine the curriculum that we share today for future uses, whether that's additional land and water staff that, new hires, new DADCAP engineers, or other audiences. So please, give us your feedback along the way. We'll be asking early and often. Okay, so the series that we are sharing is based on what we call the 3 questions approach to hydrologic assessment and restoration. And the first question, how did hydrology function historically? What's changed is question number 2. And then how can we bring back health using the knowledge of the past to guide us? And here we are. This is the trajectory of these webinars. We are still in module 1. Today is part 2 of module 1. I'll say more on that in a moment. But so we're very much today still in the how did hydrology function historically, and really talking about what are the concepts and what are the resources we need to be aware of to be thinking about that historical context. In module 2, we'll be getting more into hydrologic assessment, and then module 3, understanding altered landscapes. And all of this will culminate with field tours this spring and summer, where we'll get out in the field, get our boots wet, and start thinking about how to apply these concepts in the real world where you all live and work. So again, module 1 is where we are today. Our first part of this series was held on December 11th, and we're gathering information on who was present or if you had a chance to review the recordings. But the focus of those were really general concepts, so perspectives on how a hydrology first approach is important and useful in our work, and also how rivers and wetlands work and work better together. Because we were very much on a high level in that particular webinar, we were bringing in a lot of examples that were not Wisconsin-based. And so today's event is really going to be bringing it home to Wisconsin with Wisconsin-based speakers and all of their vast knowledge. So today, we're going to be focusing on Wisconsin's geology and landscape, considerations for hydrologic restoration, and also geomorphology and stream and floodplain interactions. Before we get into today's new content, we would like to do just a little bit of a review from part 1. So for those of you that were on that call or had a chance to review the recording, could you please use the chat to share any notable new concepts or key takeaways that you gleaned from that module? And for those of you that are new to us today, please take the time to review those answers so you can sort of get a feel for what people got out of that event. And also maybe it'll provide a little inspiration to go back and view that webinar in its recorded form. So we're going to give this just about a minute, and then we'll move on with the rest of our show. For those of you that just joined, the moment of silence here is that we have a chat exercise going for folks that participated in the December webinar to just share their memories of some of the notable concepts or key takeaways they took from that event. So please feel free to add your insights as well. We'll be getting going in a few moments. Okay, I'm not viewing the chat myself, but I'm told it's a little lean, so I hope you all are still typing. And it would really help us a lot to hear what you had to say. I know at least some of you folks were here before, but maybe we'll move on. And we'll take a moment to go through some of the key concepts that we identified as takeaways from the last webinar. So the first, healthy river wetland corridors often have multiple channels. We've had a lot of alterations in our landscapes and a lot of management that has changed some of these more complex systems into single channel systems or single channel forms, but often they are in their healthy form more complex. River wetland corridors include 3 zones: supply, transport, and depositional zones. And another important concept is there might be more than one supply zone or transfer zone in any given corridor. To find floodplain restoration opportunities in your community, you want to look for the flat, unconfined stream reaches. And Colin Thorne described these, and as shown here, as beads on a string. And that's a concept you'll hear others today talk about and in future trainings. And vegetation and groundwater are both very important, but often overlooked drivers of hydrology. And I think one of the newer concepts for many on the last webinar was the importance of the hyporheic zone. If it's a term you're not familiar with, I know that Faith is going to cover a little more about that important part of our river corridor when she joined us. So moving on, I want to now move on to the main event here. So we have 2 great speakers today, Nelson Ham from St. Norbert College. Welcome, Nelson, and Faith Fitzpatrick from USGS. And Nelson's our first speaker, so I'm going to go ahead and invite him to, I'm going to stop sharing screen, and I'm going to invite him to share his screen while I read his bio. Okay. Nelson Ham is a geomorphologist and glacial geologist who studies the origins of landscapes. He has 35 years of professional experience, including 30 in his current role as a geology and environmental science professor at St. Norbert College in De Pere. His recent work focuses on the interrelationships between people and the environment in Wisconsin, especially historical changes, trout streams, and wetlands. Ooh. Besides his professional duties, he's worked with many organizations, including Wisconsin Wetlands Association, Trout Unlimited, Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, U.S. Forest Service, Nature Conservancy, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Northeast Wisconsin Land Trust. So very quickly, before we hand the mic off to Nelson, Nelson, are you able to screen share, or am I still hogging the... Okay, while we're troubleshooting this, we do have a little pop quiz that we're going to run, and we're doing these as little knowledge checks to just highlight some of the key concepts that we are going to cover today and give us a little bit of a baseline of where we are as a cohort of learners on these topics. So Emily, are you able to launch that? All right, so we're going to hold the answers on the pop quiz and jump right in. So I'm going to mute and turn off my video, and Nelson, take it away.
Thanks, Erin. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk this afternoon. And I'm going to get started with just the goal that I want to cover, and that's hopefully, it's got a little bit of a disclaimer, and that is I'm going to be talking about a lot of things. I know it can be a bit overwhelming. Keep in mind that the idea is just to kind of make you feel more comfortable thinking about geology when you're doing restoration projects. Kind of a brief, bird's eye view of the geology of the state and some of the things that you might want to consider when you're working on projects, and also some resources that you can turn to when you finally need them. So I divided the talk into 3 sections. I wanted to just show you a few quick examples of how watershed geology is important in understanding, say, the function of streams in this particular case, but we could also be talking about wetlands or lakes and ponds as well. And then we'll talk, for the most part, about the general geology of the state. We'll do both the bedrock geology and also the glacial geology, and talk a little bit about why you either do or don't need to consider both of those things. And then at the end, I just wanted to show you some of the geologic resources that are available over most of the state that might be useful in projects that you're working on. I always like to start with these two slides. The one on the left is a generic kind of watershed map. The blue lines obviously represent the stream network that's within the red boundary, which is the drainage defined that defines the watershed, which is, the streams and all of the land area within that red area. And if you were to cut a slice through that landscape, you can kind of imagine a situation like on the right, where you've got the recharge area for streams, meaning the land surface that takes in precipitation. And then in that particular case, showing you that there's a groundwater system that exists as well, and groundwater preferentially moves from the high areas to the low areas. If you think back to the map on the left, ultimately, when you're looking at a river, stream, or a lake, or a pond, or a wetland, that water starts as precipitation. But if you consider the stream network, even on that map, if you added up all of the surface area of the blue lines, and you compare that to the surface area of the areas that are between the streams, there's a huge difference, right? And so the idea to keep in mind always is that most of the water that you are working with in a landscape ultimately started as precipitation that landed on dry ground, and either moved to the stream, for example, over the surface or through the subsurface as part of the groundwater system. And what that's going to mean is the water is going to be modified over time because it is interacting with the geology at the surface and the geology that's in the subsurface. And that's just kind of a broad concept that always worth stressing, I think, at the beginning. So what are some of the things that might be impacted by watershed geology? We could have a really long list. I just took out a few of the major ones: water chemistry, water temperature, the way that the stream channel functions in the landscape or channel type, drainage type and density, the way that a stream responds to precipitation events, so its flow or discharge, the sediment type that's in the channel, the nature or the function of that hyporheic zone, which you learned about last week, and there are lots of other considerations. So I just want to show you and give you a couple of things or scenarios to think about. One kind of looks at groundwater temperature, something called base flow index, and the trout streams in the state of Wisconsin. On the right is a map. The dark lines represent the designated class 1, 2, and 3 trout streams from DNR for the state of Wisconsin. And underneath it, it's overlain on this color map, which goes from 0 to 100%, that basically is showing you what's called base flow index. And base flow index is essentially what percent over, a year, let's say, what percentage of the total flow in a river or stream is coming from base flow, which is groundwater fed. So again, base flow index is referring to what are the stream characteristics like in terms of the contributions of groundwater base flow to the channel. And one of the things that stands out is, right, obviously that our trout streams are primarily in places where the base flow contribution to stream flow is more than 50%, 60%. And then you have the eastern part of the state and the southeast and this region kind of right in the middle where it's less than that, and trout streams are relatively uncommon. Why is that so critical, or what's going on there, and what's the contribution of watershed geology? Well, there's a really interesting phenomenon about groundwater. The map on the left is an EPA map that shows you the temperature of groundwater in the shallow subsurface. So think about groundwater 10, 20, 30, 40 feet below the surface. And if you look at the temperature lines for Wisconsin, the uppermost one is 42 degrees Fahrenheit. The one that's in the southern part of the state is 47. So basically what we're looking at is that across the state of Wisconsin, starting, let's say, up in Ashland, groundwater temperatures approach maybe 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And then at the state line with Illinois, they're close to 50. Trout, obviously, and I know most of you know this, or all of you know this, need cold water to have good habitat. It becomes lethal in terms of temperature when temperatures get above around 70 degrees or so. And so if you have a stream channel that has a greater contribution of groundwater, what that means is that over the entire year, it's receiving also a good supply of cold water. And that's ultimately what kind of determines where the trout streams are in the state that have natural reproduction. The little X that I put on the right side map, because that's where I'm located, I'm in Brown County. It's a really, if you want to kind of put in perspective, well, why is this important or why would it be useful? What's the point? Over the last few years in Brown County, there's been a major effort to start to do some hydrologic restoration along the East River, which I'll show you in a picture in a little bit, which is a tributary to the Fox. And when thinking about if that restoration achieves its goals, what might the goal be in terms of, let's say, providing recreation in terms of a fishery? We're in a region where we have a stream that receives relatively little amount of input from groundwater, cold groundwater, versus, say, overland flow during precipitation events or off of the surface of the landscape because of the landscape geology. And so trying to, let's say, incorporate an inland trout fishery to the East River probably wouldn't be a wise use of time and effort versus, let's say, thinking about it as potentially being a fishery for more warm water tolerant fish like smallmouth bass and pike, as an example. Second thing I wanted to point out that I think Faith is going to be spending a lot more time on is how geology can control the actual function of the river that you're working with. These are two slides of the Wolf River in the northeast part of the state. On the left, the channel goes right down the middle of that black and white air photo, and the kind of splotchy white areas represent the occurrence of falls and rapids. That slide is just a few miles north of Kashina on the Menominee Reservation. The image on the left, the air photo on the right, is a few miles south of Shawano, in Shawano County. It's the same river. The difference is that the one on the right is a pattern that comes about because the river transitions onto relatively thick sand that was left behind during the last ice age. And so on the left, the watershed geology is exerting a really important control on river channel. It's fairly straight. It has a lot of falls and rapids over bedrock. And then in the right-hand case, you have a fully meandering alluvial river system. And you can see the meanders really clearly, the oxbow lakes that are left behind. And also you can see in the vegetation kind of the pattern of the point bar deposits. So obviously you can have a single stream or river, and as it flows across Wisconsin's landscape, depending on what the geology is, you'll get a very different functioning channel type. And that's often something that's really important when thinking about what kind of things you can expect the river to do over time. The last thing, and I'll go back to a couple of rivers that I pointed out earlier, is when we're thinking about geologic materials, like the rocks that we're going to be talking about or the glacial deposits, one of the things that's going to be really important is just thinking about and understanding how each of those materials can transmit water through them. And all of you I know are probably familiar with the chart that I put on the left, which is basically from the NRCS and talks about infiltration rates of soils, right? Which is simply the rate at which a geologic material at the surface of the earth with the soil developed in it can take in water that's reached the surface, let's say by precipitation. When you're thinking about the contribution of the geology, and we're thinking about things not just right at the upper few feet of the surface, but tens of feet down, then we're most likely working with groundwater. And in that particular case, you're going to be thinking about a pretty big variation in how well rocks and sediment can move water. And hydrogeologists call that hydraulic conductivity. It's a fancy looking chart, but basically hydraulic conductivity varies over 12 orders of magnitude. So essentially what we're saying is that certain rocks and sediment can let water move through them at rates of, say, several feet per day, let's say in a really clean sand and gravel. And the opposite extreme would be water that's trapped in a layer of clay from a glacial lake in Wisconsin, essentially doesn't move anywhere over thousands of years. And so that's going to be a consideration as well sometimes. What kind of material is the landscape made of? And how easily is groundwater able to move through that? So I wanted to show you two examples using the two rivers that I know fairly well. I usually visit them. In one case almost every day I see it, and on the other case several times every summer. And that is the East River, which is the one I just mentioned to you. This is in Brown County. This is McCaslin Brook, which is a small trout stream in northern Oconto County within the Nicolet National Forest. I took these photos. Both of them are the same in the sense that they were about 24 hours after a fairly major precipitation event. And in the case of the East River Basin, which a few of you are familiar with, this is a really typical characteristic of a big summer storm coming through. The water goes up very quickly and reaches flood stage. It's carrying a lot of fine sediment in it because of the geology of the basin. And then it'll also go back down fairly quickly again. The same kind of precipitation event, let's say in northern Oconto County, where McCaslin Brook is in many cases, it's hardly even noticeable. You don't notice much change in terms of the sediment load in the water. So how turbid is it? It goes up and down less in the way it responds to an individual precipitation event, and it stays fairly clear. The fundamental difference between these two is that the East River watershed is in large part has 50 to 60 feet of clay from the surface down. And in the case of McCaslin Brook, we're looking at a sand and gravel landscape left behind through the last ice age that has really high infiltration rates. There's very little overland flow when it rains. Almost all of that water that infiltrates then becomes part of the groundwater system. And in the case of the East River, you get a lot of overland flow because the infiltration rates are very low. I'm going to stop there quickly. Aaron?
Yeah, Emily's going to launch the results from the poll. I think you should all be able to see that on your screen, I hope. And then does it give us the answers too? Yeah. Sorry, y'all, we're trying a new approach to quizzes. So Nelson, why don't you just take a moment to share the correct answers on these 4 poll questions, if you would, please.
Sure. So, at the beginning of our talk, you answered 3 questions. Some of these things may be new to you. I imagine many things are not. In the first case, I was asking, what's the most likely temperature range of groundwater flowing, let's say, from a spring in Wisconsin, where you're getting really good groundwater flow? And if you remember back to the EPA chart, you could expect something between 40 and 50 degrees, which is about as cold of a water as we have in Wisconsin's geologic landscape to work with. Second was when a watershed hasn't received precipitation for several weeks. So let's say we're going through almost like a mini drought. What's the primary source of water that keeps a stream from running dry in Wisconsin? It's going to be principally groundwater. And then lastly, what are the following characteristics are controlled by watershed geology, chemistry, temperature, channel type, or sediment, or all of the above? The obvious answer was that all of these things can be influenced or controlled in one way or another by the watershed geology.
Great, thanks. We can keep going.
All right. So this middle section is going to be a little bit longer, and it probably will go fairly fast in terms of trying to keep up with the material, but I hope I've kind of put it together in a way where, again, you're kind of getting some sense of why the geology would be useful and a little bit about the general geology that we have in the state. So the map that I put on the right is based on LIDAR data. It's a digital elevation model of the state of Wisconsin, right? The highest parts of the landscape are the browns and almost white, and then the lower parts would be the darker greens. The red line that I've drawn in there, which will be important to us, is the southern limit of glacial deposits in the state. And we're talking about the area that was directly covered by the last ice sheet. The yellow line and the area, especially between the yellow and the red, represents a region of older glacial deposits, which are not necessarily well constrained in terms of when they were laid down, but we do know that they predate the very last big advance of the last ice sheet into Wisconsin about anywhere from 15 to 25 or 30,000 years ago. So at this scale, and that's kind of the focus that I'm going to keep, there are really kind of, for me, kind of three regions that really stand out. This big upland region in the north, which has the highest average elevations in the state, is called the Northern Highlands. Timms Hill, the highest point in the state, is just shy of 2,000 feet above sea level. It's right about here in southeastern Price County. And so you get lots of elevations up here in the landscape that are 1,500, 1,700 feet in elevation. The southwestern part, which is outside of the glaciated region, either the earlier glacial deposits or the most recent one, stands out, on all maps. Most people in Wisconsin eventually learn fairly quickly that that's what we call the driftless area. Drift just means glacial deposits of some sort. So if it's driftless, it means that we don't have any glacial deposits there that were directly left behind by the ice. Has a really well integrated drainage system of rivers. It has very high local relief, but it is not as high as the Northern Highlands region. And so this area to the north is really the highest part of the state. The driftless area is what I'd call the hilliest part of the state, if you want to think of it that way. But it's not highest, it's several hundred feet lower. And then the last thing is to consider that the Northern Highlands and the eastern half of Wisconsin are also covered by glacial deposits, and the driftless area isn't. And there turns out to be somewhat similar geology between the driftless area and the eastern part of Wisconsin. The major difference is that in the eastern part of Wisconsin, those same rocks that we see over here are buried beneath 10, 20 to 100 feet of glacial sediment. And as a result, the landscape looks different, and the kinds of things that you want to consider when doing hydrologic restoration are going to be different in terms of geology. Okay, so I thought of one way to start to look at the geology was with a map. And then I decided I was going to switch to something that we usually don't do first, and that's look at a cross section. So this is a nice cartoon cross section of the geology of Wisconsin. And imagine that you're in the northern part of the state on the left-hand side, and you're in the southern part of the state or the southeast on the right. And even though there's a lot of things labeled here, the things that I want you to focus on first are this gray area with the plus signs is exposed at the surface, including with these other areas they were showing as maybe different rock types. And once you get about in the middle of the state and you go southward, you start to get into rocks that are much younger than these. So these would be hundreds of millions of years old versus billions of years old. And they're of a very different type. This northern region is underlain mostly by what geologists would call igneous and metamorphic rocks. Granite would be an obvious one. Basalt, which you might have heard of, is another. When you get to the southern part of the state, these rocks still exist, but they're deep in the subsurface. So they typically aren't important in terms of considering groundwater flow, for example, to surface water. Instead, we focus on the rocks that overlie those, and these are all sedimentary rocks, mostly sandstone and limestone or dolostone, as we call it, and they're almost perfectly flat lying. They've experienced almost no what we call post-depositional change. They're not what we call faulted or broken or folded intensely in any way. They're relatively simple, layered rocks, one on top of each other. That's the two major regions that I want you to think about. And in particular, I want to translate that now to a map view. And this figure that I have on the left is the really simple geologic map of the state put out by the Wisconsin Geological Survey. There are more detailed maps that we'll talk about in a little bit. But you can see that this big region in the north, with all the complexity that you see as different colors, That's the region of the state that has the Precambrian rocks exposed, the igneous and metamorphic rock. And anything to the west and to the south and to the east of that, even though the map pattern looks like it might be complicated, that's just a function of the way the streams are eroding into the rocks. This is the major region of sedimentary rock that's draped over the top of those rocks to the north and the south. And so from a groundwater perspective, when you're thinking about a project, you're mostly thinking about what's the rock that's closest to the surface, right, in the watershed that I'm working at. And depending on where you are in the state, you're going to be thinking about one of three different bedrock geology systems. The Precambrian rock represents these very old and complex rocks to the north. This gray rock unit on the geologic map is set aside as one particular important aquifer in the eastern part of the state, the Silurian dolomite or dolostone. And then for the rest of the state, the sandstone unit that is exposed at the surface where you see the tan color and it's buried underneath the younger rocks every place else, that sandstone becomes a really important aquifer as well, either at the surface in some places or buried beneath the surface at others. So let me show you really quickly and give you a few things to think about in terms of, well, how might these areas be different? What's their importance to thinking about surface water? Here's a quick slide of, I think these are the dells of the Eau Claire River in northern Wisconsin. The Precambrian granite is exposed there. It's a very complex structure. Most of the time, groundwater flow is only through the cracks or fractures that are in the rock, which we call secondary porosity, because the rock itself is way too tight to hold water and transmit it. It's essentially dry, except for the water that's in the cracks and the pores. In general, it's considered to be a low yield rock unit for aquifer use, for use at the surface by wells. One of the reasons that we don't have a lot of large communities in northern Wisconsin historically is because if they used groundwater for their water supply, there's very little to get out of the granite rock and the related rocks in the subsurface. Its contribution to surface water really varies a lot. So you could be in places where there's a sufficient amount of groundwater in those rocks and the cracks that they play an important role in providing water to streams as base flow. But in many other areas, their contribution will be relatively low. The next slide is the first of the two major sedimentary rock aquifers. If you're working in the eastern part of the state, from the tip of Door County all the way down to the Illinois state line, and extending outward, kind of to a line from southern Green Bay to Lake Winnebago to the south, you're working with a much simpler upper rock unit. And most of you from the eastern part of the state have seen quarries that expose rocks like this. This is the relatively undisturbed dolostone or limestone rocks, as we call them. They're nearly flat lying. They have often what we call karst features developed in them, which means that these rocks are actually pretty easily dissolved away, even by ordinary rainwater that reaches the surface and percolates or infiltrates into them. And so it can serve as a good aquifer and a source of base flow into streams, lakes, and wetlands in the eastern part of the state, especially in places where the cover of the glacial deposits is fairly thin and these rocks are right at or relatively close to the surface. But this is a really typical view of the Silurian dolomite, whether or not you would be in Door County or go far to the south. So one of the things I just wanted to stress there is with the Precambrian rocks in the north, things change really quickly as you go from one place to the next. If you were standing in North Chicago and you went up to Door County along the shoreline, you could expect the rocks to be almost identical in general characteristics from one place to the other a few hundred miles away. One last thing to keep in mind, in some parts of eastern Wisconsin, Kewaunee County is kind of like the hot spot for this historically. If the glacial deposits on top are relatively thin, The groundwater that's in these rocks can be contaminated really quickly by pesticides, herbicides, manure. Spills, for example, are notorious for, infiltrating and modifying the groundwater quality, which can then impact surface water quality. And again, that's just something to consider in places where the glacial deposits are relatively thin. Lastly, I wanted to talk about the Cambrian aquifer, and then we'll talk about the glacial deposits. This is a typical view of sandstone that serves as an aquifer throughout the east, south, and western part of Wisconsin. Remember that in the far west, far south, and far east, these rocks are typically buried below the surface and they're overlain by those younger dolostone-rich rocks. Where the sandstone is relatively shallow, it's a really important aquifer. Groundwater can move through the spaces between the sand grains as well as through the cracks in the rock. One other thing to consider in places where it's overlain by the younger dolostones is that the chemistry of the groundwater in the sandstones can get highly influenced by the changes that take place in the water as it moves through the overlying dolostone. And that's an important consideration, for example, in the driftless area, which geochemically are very rich streams in terms of the dissolved ions and cations that then make them very rich in terms of aquatic insect ecology and aquatic plant ecology, which then leads into being really productive trout streams in that particular case. And so that's just the last major aquifer to consider. And again, I think what's important to remember is where you're working in the state, you're mostly going to be concerned with what's the rock that's at the surface or buried by the glacial deposits. If the rocks, like the Precambrian rocks in southern Wisconsin, are hundreds to a few thousand feet below the surface, they no longer become a critical part, usually, of influencing surface water systems. Okay, let's talk real briefly about the glacial geology of Wisconsin, which oftentimes to many people, when I get questions about it, seems kind of overwhelming at first. And so what we're going to do is kind of take the view of really focusing on general distribution of different kinds of glacial deposits. And again, focusing on their ability to transmit water and that role that they play in watershed geology. Most people you meet in Wisconsin know that the state was glaciated. The map in the lower left, all of the blue, no matter what the color is, and the red that's on this map of North America is showing you the total area that was covered by a glacier during the last ice age. So again, about 15,000 to 30,000 years ago. One thing that happened when the ice encountered the Great Lakes basins, as it was getting thinner, it broke up into distinct kind of tongues of ice and lobes of ice. And so it's not a nice straight, let's say, east-west boundary between driftless area and glaciated area. Instead, if you look at the map on the right, the edge of the glacier had this very distinct kind of what we call lobate pattern to it. So any place that was under the white area was directly covered by the ice. The earlier glacial deposits are kind of these gray areas, and then the driftless areas to the southwest. We do give geographic names to these different parts just for the standpoint of communicating. Superior Lobe, Chippewa Lobe, Wisconsin Valley, Langlade. Green Bay Lobe was the largest, and then the Lake Michigan Lobe in the state was not very big, but that ice actually buried all of Lake Michigan Basin and down into Illinois. So this is kind of the basic geography of the Ice Age geology of the state. And before we talk about deposits, I'll try to hopefully make some sense for you about how to think about geologic materials in the landscape, the glacial deposits. The left diagram is one that's often reproduced in some form or another in textbooks. The idea is that the glacier, when it was at its largest, stopped where this ridge is, which we call a moraine, which again, most or all of you have probably heard of before. It's a ridge of glacial deposits that are built up on the edge of the glacier. This slide is also emphasizing what's happening when the glacier is now retreated or it's melting away, and what kinds of materials you might leave between that moraine where it went its furthest, and then areas that it's uncovering as it goes back. The main thing to think about is that when the glacier is advancing, and they're trying to show this as this dark brown layer, you usually get a deposit called till, and till is directly laid down by the ice, and it has very distinctive characteristics. It's a very unsorted material, and I'll show you a picture in a second. It's the kind of thing that you would expect to find in areas that have drumlins, which are also formed under the ice as the ice is kind of dragging across the Earth's surface. You also expect to find till in the moraines of one sort or another. But instead, what you expect to find beyond where the glacier got and in the landscape around, let's say, the drumlin areas when the glacier is retreating, are going to be meltwater deposits. And typically, we just separate them into two kinds. One is going to be outwash, which is meltwater river, sand, and gravel. And then the second is going to be glacial lake deposits that are left behind in places where the water was being ponded. And so in Wisconsin's landscape, even though this is like a 20-mile view or more above the surface, here's the southern end of Green Bay. These are the Baraboo Hills. This is the lower part of the Wisconsin River. Stevens Point would be about here, and Lake Winnebago is this flat surface here. Even at this scale, you can see this pattern of moraines and drumlins. The moraines stand out as ridges, and along the western side of the Green Bay Lobe, they're very prominent. And if you look in the region, let's say between Beaver Dam and Madison, chain of lakes, there is a kind of grain to the ground that runs roughly north to south. And up here, let's say west of Green Bay towards Wausau, there is a grain to the ground that's running east to west. These are big drumlin zones that form behind the ice when it stood out at its maximum extent in terminal moraine and are indicating the direction that's the ice is flowing in. Anything that's usually between these drumlins is going to be partially or fully buried by sand and gravel, or it's going to be glacial lake materials. And so just try to keep in mind till versus outwash versus lake sediment. Those are going to be, for the most part, in most places, the three major kinds of materials that you're typically thinking about. So, what does that look like in the landscape? What do these things actually look like? First of all, this map is from the Geological Survey, State Geological Survey of Wisconsin. It's over 50 years old. I'll tell you a little bit more about it when we talk about resources. It's being replaced this year by a much more detailed map. But I'll tell you that this old map is still really useful because it simplifies the geology of the state in just 2 of 5 different colors for the most part. The glacial lakes are the regions shown in light blue, and we had 3 major ones. One up here in the Lake Superior Basin, this one in the Lake Winnebago Basin called Glacial Lake Oshkosh, and then we had a third right in the middle of the state called Glacial Lake Wisconsin. For the most part, most of the glacial lakes in the state, Oshkosh and Glacial Lake Duluth, as it was called up here, have very clay lake sediment in my picture B. Hopefully you're thinking about infiltration rate and hydraulic conductivity. This is very clay-rich and silt-rich material that really inhibits flow and encourages a lot of overland flow, relatively low infiltration, and groundwater flow in those landscapes. The brown areas, whether they're light or dark, you're focusing on regions that are either moraines or drumlins, and you expect mostly to find till in those landscapes. This slide A is a typical till in my part of the world, up in Brown County, Allegheny County. It probably doesn't look like much, but it's a hodgepodge of clay, silt, sand, and gravel all mixed together. Depending on whether there's a lot of clay and silt it can either be towards that end of having low hydraulic conductivity. If it's a sandier till, it can move towards the higher hydraulic conductivity. By far, the most hydraulically conductive glacial deposits are going to be slides C and D. D is outwash, sand and gravel pit in Wisconsin. C is actually glacial lake deposits from Glacial Lake, Wisconsin. The geology in the central part of the state meant that that lake was much sandier instead of being very clay rich for Lake Oshkosh and Duluth. And so you can have a really large variability in hydraulic conductivity between those two deposits. Almost done. Last one that I've put in here is a sand dune in Wisconsin. Sand dunes are not mapped at this scale. They are mapped at the more detailed maps that I'll show you in a little bit that are available. Most of the windblown sand in Wisconsin is a product of blowing up glacial lake sands or sorting glacial outwash. So oftentimes when you have dunes, they're going to be the very uppermost unit. They're widespread, but they're not over very large areas necessarily across the state. But in some instances, that's something that you might be working. Lastly, and then we'll take a quick break. We need to talk about how this glacial geology plays a role in aquifers in the state. We talked about 3 bedrock aquifers. This last one, which is so critical where it occurs, is a groundwater supply, is called the sand and gravel aquifer of Wisconsin. The map that you're seeing, the big one with the orange areas outlined, those are places in the state that are dominated by sand and gravel, high infiltration rates, high hydraulic conductivity. And if you remember back to this glacial map from the state, if we took the yellow areas and the orange areas, they're actually both sand and gravel, and you showed them as one color, it basically equals the big map that you're looking at. We'll talk about why they separated orange from yellow in just a second, but keep in mind that those are essentially the same kinds of materials. They are almost all sand and gravel, sometimes a little more sandy, sometimes a little more gravelly, but nonetheless, they have very high infiltration rates. They transmit groundwater very well. They're a really important superficial aquifer where they occur. They yield a lot of groundwater. In places that you're working in these regions, they're really critical to your surface water bodies. Almost always, they are the primary source of groundwater or base flow into lakes and wetlands and streams. And similar to the eastern aquifer we talked about earlier, the Dolostone, because they're so porous, they can be easily contaminated as well, which can be an issue in certain areas where, again, manure, pesticides, herbicides applied at the wrong time or too much can really impact the water quality in those regions as well. Lastly, the very last slide, I promise, is what about these kettles? The sand and gravel that we see in the state and the till, in many cases, was deposited on top of or around big blocks of glacial ice that broke off as the glacier was melting away. This is an old image that just does a nice job showing how a kettle lake can form. And imagine that you've got a glacier that's retreating, it's stagnating blocks of ice. Those blocks are getting partially or fully buried by glacial deposits. Eventually, that ice is going to melt away and the ground is going to collapse into that depression. So imagine this ice block finally melts away and the overlying deposits collapse into it. It eventually fills with water. That's how kettles form in Wisconsin. And one of the critical things in understanding of wetlands, most wetlands in many parts of the state, is that especially those that are not necessarily right along river courses, but they're in the landscape, are almost entirely the product of kettle formation during ice retreat. When the last glacier finally left out of the state, wetland scientists know this really well. And this really great map with the green represents wetlands. in the state, and you'll notice that you can draw a line clearly along the edge of where the glass glacier existed, the Laurentide ice sheet. Most of our wetlands are contained within those zones, keeping in mind that there were more in the east but have been drained for agriculture primarily. And we have a concentration of them in central Wisconsin, which is where Glacial Lake, Wisconsin was located. Relatively few in the older glacial area or in the driftless region. So when you're thinking about wetlands in most parts of the state, northern and the eastern half and the central, you have a glacial origin to consider in terms of why they're there and how they form.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much, Nelson. We're gonna, did you want to explain this slide? I was just gonna say we're gonna launch a quick poll to do a little knowledge check. You were so very thorough. I think people are gonna ace this, but you want to say anything about this?
Sure. This was just a quick question. We'll have a short break and then finish with a quick set of slides just talking about resources. If you want to, when you decide you need to dwell into the geology of the state for your project areas, I've labeled 3 areas on the landform map: the Northern Highlands, the Driftless area, and then just kind of generically in the Fox River Valley. And the question is, for the way I had it set up was for each of these areas, what would be the combination of conditions that would favor, or what are the combination of geologic conditions for that area that you might need to think about? In the north, we're talking about, is it igneous and metamorphic rock or sedimentary? Same choice for B and same choice for C.
Okay, we'll just let this roll for a minute or so. See, the responses are really pouring in. Thank you.
You want me to go ahead and talk about the next question?
Yeah, we can, or people
Okay.
can just read ahead. I think it's all pretty
Yeah, and then
self-explanatory.
when you scroll down, the second set of questions has to do with whether it was a glacial region or not. And then lastly, kind of the nature of wetlands in the landscape.
Thank you. And for anyone that's having trouble, if the poll is in the way of their map and they can't see what they're looking at, you just have to click on the top of the poll, the bar, and pull it to the side. And that'll be true throughout the rest of the presentation. Looks like we're still getting a few responses. There were 9 questions, so thanks for slogging through them. And still coming, huh? Okay, maybe like 10 more seconds. Could do a countdown. 9, 8, 7. Looks like it's stabilizing out. So why don't we go ahead and end the poll and share the results, and then we can move on to the last few moments.
Sure.
Okay. So correct answers are embedded in there if anyone wants to scroll through and see how they did. But otherwise, you can click out of that poll and we can keep moving.
All right. Last few slides. With a little bit of a disclaimer here. This is the part where you might look and feel like you're being overwhelmed with publications and other sources of information that maybe you're not typically using, but now you might find really helpful. The number one place to go to get pretty much all of the maps that I'm going to be talking about, for the most part, is the State Geological Survey in Madison, which is a great website. All of their maps, even those that were published years ago in paper form, are now available for download or for viewing online. And then also keep in mind, you can contact people like me and Faith in different parts of the state where you're working if you need some help thinking about what resources you might want to get that you aren't aware of. Everybody is happy to do that. So real quickly, I want to just talk about what's available thinking about bedrock and glacial geology. This map on the right, I'll get to in just a second, but the area that I've outlined in red is roughly the area that I'm showing you here on the left with something I know that all of you are familiar with. This is a soil map, right, that you would get off of the online web soil survey available from NRCS. And I think one of the things that really helps when you're working on these projects is if you can start off with a broader view of the landscape and maybe a simpler one, and then work towards the details instead of sometimes trying to make heads out of a map that at the beginning is showing you a small area with a tremendous amount of detail. And I think this is a good example. This is a location that's on the Outagamie County line with Brown County. The county line actually goes right here through about the right third of that block. Recently, I was talking to some folks in Outagamie County about the geology of an area that they're interested in looking in more detail in terms of the groundwater, flow. And one of the issues they had was just kind of understanding what's really going on in a large view versus what they're seeing, let's say, on the soil maps. This is an example of a state geological map that shows the glacial geology at a scale of 1 to 100,000. Those maps are fairly detailed. The grid that you see on here are individual 1 square mile sections. And it's a bit hard to see, but basically, if you're looking in here, this area of sand, which was the one that they were interested in looking at, basically encompasses about 10 different soil units right there. And here is designated with 1 unit that really clearly says, okay, this is windblown sand. These are the kind of maps now that are available for virtually the entire state and are the obvious starting point when you're thinking about the glacial geology for your particular county, let's say that you're working in. I promised earlier that this map, which is now 50 years old of the state, is going to be replaced, and it's going to be replaced by this really spectacular map that should be available in the next couple of months on the State Geological Survey website. There's some advantages, I think, and disadvantages to using that. This is a nice one to just gain perspective, right, on what deposits you might be dealing with. This is the one that's going to be giving you a whole new level of detail. Also telling you what the deposits are, but also giving you information on what we call stratigraphic units, which is basically a nomenclature system geologists use to name different areas of different deposits. It's something that you would eventually get involved, in trying to understand, but it's actually very laid out. I've read this map several times and reviewed it. This is a really nice starting point when you want to think about the entire state as a perspective. And remember, I mentioned earlier that there are 1 to 100,000 maps available, which would really be the ones that would probably be most useful when you're looking at a site. And these are now available for almost the entire state, with some notable exceptions in the West. But any color here that you see in blue or green are maps that are either published, the ones in blue, or will be published fairly soon in green. These are usually published at the county scale. In some cases, there are multiple counties in one map, but the scale of the maps is still the same. On this map, again, the grid system that you see here represents 1 section, 1 square mile. And also you're going to have descriptions of the geologic materials, fairly short. But again, it's the kind of thing that might really help you get a landscape perspective before you start zooming in on a specific project on, say, a specific section of stream. And then lastly, you may find use looking at subsurface information. It varies quite a bit. The WDNR has all of their well construction reports available and searchable online. Those are construction reports that are submitted by water well drillers. Consultants usually do things that we call soil borings or monitoring wells. Those are sometimes available for projects that were done previously by local firms, or maybe for you, for the county. The construction reports are freely available to anyone. There's a nice DNR website that allows you to look by geographic area, and they vary in quality, but they can be very helpful. Remember earlier I showed you and we compared the East River versus McCaslin Brook. This is from a well record close to the East River, and it's showing us that there's roughly 60 feet of clay before you get into 25 feet of gravel and stones, and then finally into the bedrock. This really explains the nature of the groundwater interaction with the channels and the surface water. And up here by McCaslin Brook, we have a really thick sequence of outwash or sand and gravel that's at least 100 feet thick, 104 feet thick. They just didn't need to go any deeper. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much,
if you have
Nelson.
any questions. Yep.
Yeah. Well, so we had, and remember folks, I'm trying to get my video back on, that this is a pilot. We did have some time that we were hoping to have for a little bit of questions now and an exercise, but in the interest of making sure we give Faith her full time, we're going to hold the questions till the end. But I do have one item for you that you could do in the chat while and Nelson, if you want to go ahead and stop sharing, we'll get Faith sharing her screen to keep us moving. Recall we did some whiteboard exercises last webinar, and we're going to do that again at the end. And this is our question will be, so please give it some thought for Nelson's part of the program as well, is, what did you hear or learn today that was new to you and seems important for your work? And obviously there were a lot of things that were important to your work. And how might you apply it moving forward? So you're welcome to comment on that in the chat, or just to make a note to yourself and hold your comment until we get to the whiteboard session. So I'm going to introduce Faith Fitzpatrick now, and we'll get going. So Faith Fitzpatrick is a research hydrologist at the U.S. Geologic Survey's Upper Midwest Water Science Center. She has spent much of her career studying geomorphic characteristics and sediment dynamics of rivers related to land use and climate change. Her area of expertise is in historical watershed geomorphology and sediment budgets, specifically identifying natural and human causes for accelerated erosion and sedimentation problems, flooding, habitat degradation, eutrophication, and sources of contaminants. And of course, if any of you are familiar with Wetlands Association's work in the Marengo River watershed, Faith has been a really critical partner and collaborator on that work. She also works closely with water resources and fisheries managers from a variety of agencies in a scientific support role for decision-making, is a lecturer in the UW-Madison Geography Department, and an instructor for the USGS Training Center. And Faith, we are going to actually go ahead and skip past the pre-quiz, so you can go ahead and skip the slide and let it roll. Welcome, Faith.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for having me today. Can you see my slides?
We can.
Okay.
Yes, we can.
Good. It says I'm sharing, but I'm not. Yeah, you know how it is. Too many screens. All right. So today I'm going to pass by the pop quiz there, right? Pass by the pop quiz. And
Yes,
just go, yep. And then we'll jump right into, remember, like at the beginning of the webinar today, Erin went through some of the concepts that Colin had brought up in the December webinar. And so we'll look at those today and apply them in the Wisconsin setting as much as possible. And in the back of my mind, so we got these concepts going on, and I want to make sure that what I show you today kind of helps to answer your so what questions. Why does it matter? So hopefully I'm able to do that with this group of slides that I put together for this. And so kind of three things that we'll look at is the thinking about streams as like fluvial systems. So not necessarily just channels and surface, but like what's going on longitudinally, upstream, downstream, and then laterally connections. Like what are all those connections? We have the three drivers that we've kind of talked about of hydrology, biology, and geology. And how do those kind of interplay across our Wisconsin landscapes that Nelson described so well over the last presentation. And then we'll kind of look at groundwater even in more detail. in a couple different settings, in both that's kind of the headwaters and the floodplain settings. And I just have this very, very simple diagram of hydraulic, kind of the hydrologic zones that we think of in watersheds, from precipitation to overland flow, that runoff portion goes underground. Then we have saturated zones. And generally, typically, as we increase that size of our drainages, and we get into larger floodplains and more kind of interaction of maybe groundwater from larger sources. And we'll kind of see how that is maybe different across the Wisconsin landscapes. The other thing that you've probably seen this a few times now, different versions of it. It's been around for 50 years, but looking at this kind of longitudinal connectivity, and it kind of is driven by flow and sediment supply. And usually you see it where there's like mountainous headwaters with steep slopes, big sediment supply, a transfer zone for those, and then a depositional zone. And it might be nutrients as well, but it's kind of displayed that way. And then in Wisconsin, we have both steep and flat headwater environments like you saw in Nelson's slides. And so we have this triangle of different drivers that kind of affect the streams across our Wisconsin landscapes. And I just thought I'd put this in here too, because a lot of the practice of looking at streams and assessing streams, on the physical side, it's kind of been driven by the flood characteristics, or if you're familiar with the bank full flows and natural channel designs that were a way of getting more stable channels that we're kind of in that transfer zone when we think about headwaters to those depositional zones. So that's kind of where there's been a lot of focus in the past and across the U.S. So here's the first question. So, and I should kind of explain this, and I think you're gonna put up, yep, we got the questions up here. So just a couple of things to explain this. I'm just going to kind of drop you right in there, kind of looking at these two different creeks. They're in the Bayfield Peninsula area, and they're forested, and they're right next to each other. So you got a couple of questions there to answer about which creek is doing what.
And again, if the poll is in your way, just please click on the bar at the top and drag it out. And also minimize it, or once you answer it, it'll go away. Okay, Faith, I think you can, we'll close the poll and you can keep going.
Oh, okay. So the first question was like, which chat? So just kind of start thinking individually with the eyes, like there's little tidbits you can pick up on this stuff. So we'll kind of go through this. So this is just kind of dropping you in cold a little bit, but so which channel looks to be most affected by floods more so than geology or vegetation? So the answer to that is Lenawee Creek here on the left. And then which channel likely has more of a sediment problem? Well, if you look at these two, this has kind of clear water. It's a little browner, kind of going towards the kind of a lot of wetland interaction here, lateral connectivity, right? So this one has more of a likely sediment problem or sediment movement happening in it. Which channel has more longitudinal connectivity? So stuff is going to move through this Lenawee Creek faster. And which has, and kind of in that longitudinal direction. And then which channel has more lateral connectivity? That's one is the East Fork of the Cranberry River. You can kind of see it's kind of spread out here, a lot of vegetation, a lot of wetlands. And as we look at different things too, like this also had to do with somewhat with the history, but also the geology. So even though those creeks are right next to each other, This one has more groundwater input than that naturally, given the glacial setting of it, just slightly different. And then, kind of hand in hand with that, then was a turn of the century, the late 1800s log drives, took place in Lenawee Creek and not the Cranberry. For one reason, it was, more wet and harder to get in to the Cranberry as it was, but those things all just kind of added to each other. And then we have differences in what the channel morphology looks like, higher banks with Lenawee, and then difference in the base flow. So they're about the same size watershed area. The base flow, so that flow between the runoff events, it's like 14 cubic feet per second. And it's only a little less than 2 in Lenawee. So right away, we can see that there's different groundwater interactions going on with the Cranberry than Lenawee. And again, they're like right next to each other. So it's kind of a idea of the diversity that we can get. And there's those indications that can tell us that even as we're kind of getting introduced to a creek and its setting. So this longitudinal connectivity, here's kind of the diagram that you saw last time. So it's really good to use this though, because it gives us that progression of how things are moving through watersheds and along stream networks. In general, the slopes gets gentler, stream flow increases. They tell us something about base level, like where that stream is intersecting a water body where the level is held constant, more or less. And then as we look at how the slope changes, it gives us an idea, too, of what changes there might be in the landforms and the geology that are affecting it. The other thing that, kind of goes hand in hand with this, and I'm not sure if it really had come up too much yet, but it also gives an idea of like what kind of valleys that we would have. And confined valleys are shown here, steep sides. The hill slopes are like right next to the stream. Again, when you're kind of in that steep textbook type setting, the transfer zone, you might have what's called a partly confined valley. So you start to have some of what we think of that floodplain or alluvial. So we're having sediment in the bottom land that's been moved around by the river, and the river can kind of be able to move it again. That's what kind of makes up a floodplain, or if you hear that term, alluvial. And then as you get down further in watersheds, or the valley is wide enough, and then you have a continuous floodplain. One of the things I keep in mind, like in general, the bed material, because of that reduction in slope, the bed material becomes finer as you go downstream. This can also be interrupted by glacial landforms and the textures, as you saw from Nelson's descriptions of things. One of the big things is that as the flows increase and with slope, we have something that's called stream power. And I know on the county levels, there's like stream power indexes that are done with like drainage area times slope. But when you get the highest stream powers, they're kind of in the middle of these watersheds. And that might be where you have these valleys that are also transitioning between confined and unconfined. So they can be big sediment producers there as well. But that can also vary then, it's how the slope changes through stream systems that intersect different landforms. So then too, we talked about beads and strings and beads. So we also want to just kind of show again that examples of that lateral connectivity, kind of going cross valley or lowland, and kind of what that looks like. You get a lot of spatial heterogeneity with that too. And then less so when you have longitudinal connectivity, where everything is like moving straight and literally faster down downstream from there. And this is an example of those the string and beads, and Nelson had that very nice one from the Wolf River. But you can go from these confined river settings or confined valleys and single channels, like in the Wolf River with the granite bedrock setting, and then quickly widen out and have that opportunity for more lateral connection. And so those can happen pretty fast. There's examples all over the place of that kind of string and bead. And these beads then is where there's a lot of diversity and a lot of resilience can be added and protected in those areas. One of the things too is just kind of revisiting the river pattern terminology that we've had. We see a lot of straight channels in a lot of examples. We also talk about anastomosing and braided, and those terms come up a lot. And, there's kind of terminology, amorphic terminology that goes with them. The anastomosing channels, they basically have I'll actually go on to the next one slide to kind of describe that more with an example. But we have the anastomosing, and then here's braided down here. So kind of picking some examples, looking around the state for where we might have anastomosing channels. And this is an example from more of like a headwater setting. And some things that are similar between the headwaters and the kind of more floodplain setting, or the depositional setting when we look at those three zones. We generally have the gentle slopes and low stream power. Vegetation is abundant. And this is the Beaver Dam River by Waterloo, for one example. Channel locations, like in Wisconsin, these can be related to springs and seeps, and how those might come out differently. That might be sensitive to water table fluctuations because they're in the headwaters. Generally don't see a whole lot of sediment coming in because they don't have that confined valley that we kind of think of in that more kind of textbooky source zone look of things. The meanders, we have sinuosity here and bends, but they tend to be inactive, and we're not seeing those kind of floodplain deposits that we see in those alluvial settings where we have laterally migrating channels. And they've probably been more common in Wisconsin before we started channelizing and ditching, and they also kind of go away when you have road crossings because everything's kind of concentrated in one spot across wetland areas. Braided rivers are pretty rare in Wisconsin. They're generally steeper slopes. You have abundant bed loads, a lot of sediment moving around, erodible banks, generally higher slopes for those than for anastomosing, variable discharge, lack of vegetation because things are pretty actively moving. And these bars, and referred to as bars instead of islands, can change rapidly. And we kind of see some indications of braided channel in the Wisconsin River. And a lot of these are relic features from the glacial outbursts, floods out of Lake Wisconsin. But we kind of get a flavor for those in the Wisconsin River. And then if we go down to the depositional zone, so farther down the river, bigger river setting, again, we get low stream power, gentle slopes. The vegetation becomes a dominant driver. The channels, they act independent of each other, similar to like they do in the headwaters. Here, though, we have sediment deposition happening. So there's usually some sediment source upstream that's going to be contributing to like the depositional setting that we find here. Also, though, road crossing, bridges, channelization kind of limited the abundance of these in Wisconsin. And Nelson showed this version of this map in reverse color, so sorry about that. But these orange colors are those high groundwater, high base flow index sites, like he described. and they're scattered around the state, both in the glacial and the driftless areas. And we can kind of relate these then. You might be familiar with base flow on hydrographs. And so I just wanted to show one of those because, like, the flood hydrographs, that's kind of that overland runoff piece of floods that we get during precipitation or snowmelt events, kind of causing a peak in the stage or the amount of flow. And then in general, in between, we have this like base flow piece. This through flow is like kind of a slower piece of the runoff, or subsurface flow it's sometimes called. But this base flow kind of represents the amount of groundwater that is in the stream system between the runoff events. And I just showed an example of one here from looking at Underwood Creek and Bark River. So these are in like the Milwaukee and Waukesha areas. Again, difference in glacial setting. Of course, Underwood is, in the middle of Wauwatosa, really urban, has had some restoration work done on it. And one of the things is to reduce the peak flows. So if we look at something like Bark River, it has a lot of wetlands adjacent to it, and in its watershed, a good chunk of wetlands. So it has this hydrograph that has these more muted peaks to it. And then it also has a higher amount of flow in between the peaks, that base flow that represents that groundwater interaction part of the Bark River. And, you can see here the steep peaks, the flashiness of Underwood. So, part of restoration is trying to kind of shave that off, and how much wetland area reconnection of floodplain is needed to be able to do that. The other thing too, when we look at, so those were the hydrographs. So those are based on peaks, floods, the flow durations. You maybe have heard these terms a lot. And so the flow durations, and when you look at the statistics from them, those come from like looking at the daily flows over the year. So it's a little bit different, so everything kind of combined. And so they also give you an idea of like the spread of what the peaks look like, those runoff events, versus like what the base flow looks like. And I have plotted up here Underwood and Bark again. Here's Underwood and Bark. So if you look at the, these flows that happen, a couple days a year or something like that, the difference, Underwoods are much higher, again, with that flashy peaks, Bark much lower. But then as you go into all that time in between the floods, the flows in Bark stay much higher compared to Underwood. So this is another form of like statistics or hydrologic statistics that you can look at to kind of tell you what's going on with the flows in the rivers. And then also, like, even in the big floods, like I thought I'd throw this example in there because it was just so amazing when we had the 2008 floods in southern Wisconsin. Here's the Kickapoo River and Baraboo. Really flashy, went up and down in a couple of days, caused a huge amount of damage, right? 30,000 cubic feet per second. And then here's the tributaries to the Rock River in the east part, draining Horicon Marsh and all those big wetland areas. So huge amount, of length of time to the flooding that went on, but not quite that steep peak. So that kind of represents all that storage in those wetland areas, and those differences in the landscapes between the driftless and the glaciated. And then this is kind of an area that's got a lot of that drumlin type of landforms as well, which kind of disconnects things. And then the state's kind of divided up in these flood frequency areas, kind of based on the rainfall, the soils, the forest cover. It kind of looks like the ecoregions or the ecological landscapes, and those kind of look like the glacial maps for the state as well. So all these things are very interconnected. One of the resources for bringing up some of those statistics, not sure if you've maybe used StreamStats, but I just thought I'd show a quick example here in StreamStats, and it's a USGS application. you can get the statistics for a gauging station, but you can also click on, if you kind of zoom in on here, you can click on any of these reaches and it'll calculate, oops, I don't know why I did, it'll calculate the, to go back, and I'm not sure how I go back. Let me see if I do it. There we go. It'll calculate based on those frequency areas and equations. It'll come up with some statistics for you, such as these are the peak floods. So this is like 50% was what we would call the 2%, the 2 year, so kind of close to maybe the bank full. And then it also, we don't have bank full statistics for Wisconsin in particular, but it'll also bring up some of the national, they're called the bigger curves for bank full and the morphology that might be expected with that. So again, though, we just have this wealth of different landforms or depositional landforms. So they're going to change very quickly across the landscape from watershed. Drumlin fields, the outwash, where you had lake plains, all different kinds of things that can be going on with that. And so that kind of supply to deposition profile then is affected by these landforms. And we have this young landscape to go with it. So then, like when we look at these different, classifications and assessments and stuff that have been done, we kind of added this kind of flat zone to represent that on the longitudinal profile, not problem, where we have basically no valley. You start to have headwater channels, no slope, and then the kind of minimal sediment source, like little sediment at that point. So kind of looking at channels too then, and like the difference between runoff and groundwater, we kind of we see a lot of diagrams like this where you just have what's going on in the surface and the storage associated, the floodplain and what the bank full elevation is. And so this is great, for these floodplain settings. It's all based on streams in alluvial settings. The concepts and the practice come from that, where you have laterally migrating channels and meanders, and you get these scroll bars and oxbows, but you get the indications that the channel is laterally migrating. And there's something called the meander belt width that you can kind of look at to describe like how wide of an area a stream needs to meander. And if you look underground too, you can see, as the floodplain is building up, these different layers buried within the floodplain. And I just wanted to show that because then it also is another place where we get variability in stratigraphy and this kind of complexity between what might be clays and sand and gravel deposits that also can affect how the groundwater interacts with the stream setting. When we go to the headwaters, we might still see sinuous and meandering looking channels, but it's kind of different because you don't see those active point bars. There's nothing that really is like telling you that the channel is moving. Instead, we kind of have the channel form in these, it's highly complex. There's a lot of difference in the width of the channel. They're kind of like, you see springs coming in. There might be old beaver activity, beaver dams, series of beaver dams. There are very, differences in landforms on a very local level. There might be anastomosing reaches, those beads and strings. They might be connecting where springs are coming into the lowland, out of drumlins or out of a moraine or an esker. And then the other thing that's kind of interesting about these is that the bends, if I, look back at the in this kind of setting here, we have these what are called foul wags, where the deepest part of the channel, we expect it to be kind of on the outside as it comes around these bends in these alluvial stream settings. When we get into the more spring-fed areas, first of all, the adjacent banks can tend to be lower because they flood more often than when you have something. The 1.5 year bankful flood is expected to flood once or twice a year usually. And if you have a wetland that's adjacent, that's usually the water table is usually pretty close to that level. The other thing is that the wood, you might see places where wood has fallen in, it's not moving because you don't have those flows that flood flows that are able to move large wood. And so here's like a example kind of zooming in where a lot of times you have the springs coming in on the outside of those bends and they tend to be mucky. So it's a little bit different than when you would think of it as being an alluvial active meander where you'd get flows in the deepest part of that channel there, and it usually is kind of pretty clean of soft sediment or fine sediment, and they tend to be they could be a little wider around those sections as well. So pretty interesting stuff. And so a lot of times we think of like groundwater is kind of coming in general, and the diagram on the left kind of shows like that's a seepage. This is a place where you have a more homogeneous layering, and the water table is right there. And that's certainly present in a lot of places in Wisconsin. And then you also get things like springs, which is more of a direct conduit, or if you have something that's retarding the groundwater flow, like a silt unit, and then you have sand. So if you have this interlayered of silts and sands or clays, then you could have a spring that's coming in along a sand unit that's being supplied by something up gradient from that point. And so those are more like point discharges than into the channels. The other thing you have, so we have kind of this gaining where groundwater is feeding into streams. You can also have it where the stream is losing to the groundwater aquifer, the area underneath the river. You can also have it kind of disconnected where the water table is underneath, or dry, where the water table is totally beneath the elevation of the stream bed. And we certainly have all of these going on in Wisconsin too, and they can happen over relatively short lengths of area and even laterally because of all the variation that we have in glacial and in the floodplain units. And also too, a lot of the streams are located in glacial meltwater valleys, and so their deposits underneath them are reflective, and those aquifers kind of reflect some of the coarse material that was moved when there was a big meltwater channel there, basically. Hyporheic zones we talked about a little bit too in the December webinar. So that's the area that's like between the shallow aquifer and the stream, and you kind of see it coming out in a couple different ways. Sometimes it's very specific to looking at like the flow through a riffle that you'd have within the stream channel itself and the bed forms. So you get flow kind of moving longitudinally and maybe through that zone. And then there's also in meanders, there's a hyporheic zone that moves in between the inside of meander bends too. So it's kind of looking at a little bit bigger area in that it's dependent on the plan form then. So one is kind of dependent on the bed forms, the other on the plan forms. And then just in general, you can kind of extend out that idea when you're looking at a more spatially diverse floodplain or lowland setting, where you can have hyporheic downwelling, upwelling, groundwater upwelling, downwelling, lateral flow. So you get a kind of, instead of kind of like we usually think flow kind of coming into streams and moving downstream, both overland and or runoff and groundwater, we can have more of this complexity of these different directions that the superficial aquifer, or how the superficial aquifer is interacting with the stream. A couple other like little side things too. Again, like with the diversity that we have of the stratigraphy, and if we're looking at like valley sides, we can also have places where in unconsolidated deposits where springs are kind of coming in along valley sides, and we certainly have this in the Bayfield Peninsula area. It's also kind of related to some of the paleo shoreline settings. This is up at Whittlesea Creek, and just kind of showing, this is kind of halfway down the hillside where you start to see some slumping and a little bit of a channel. And this is a spring that's coming in that's pretty continuous year round. Sometimes these are seasonal, but then you get into, if you have enough topography and the source area for these is large enough, they'll flow all year too, which is pretty interesting. So you can hardly see them. There's a lot of water flowing underneath this surface here. This graph is a little complicated, but it kind of shows a few things. These black lines here are the well logs that kind of put together to look at like the slice of, this is the Bayfield Peninsula going from the upland, the center part, to Lake Superior. And so here's the upland surface, and you can see the old paleo shorelines kind of popping out there as we get differences in the slopes. And then here's how the stream valley is kind of cut through that, the stream intersecting those. And then the regional water table, and this is recreated from those well logs too. So we get kind of the stratigraphy and the water table out of that. And, in Whittlesea, we have a big groundwater discharge, pretty low in the watershed coming out here where this regional aquifer intersects the stream. And so we have a lot of flow, big brook trout area there. You don't have to go too far upstream, and we're in a losing reach. So it's almost like a path, but that's like a channel that's filled with gravel. So it gets, runoff during winters, but then nothing. And then it's losing, so that's the channel is dry. And then, just a little bit further up, there's still some groundwater gaining in there. And then if we go way up to the top here, we also have the shallow aquifer kind of contributing some base flow a little bit. And then we have the water table that's pretty, where the water table is equivalent to the water level in the stream. So that's how fast things can change. And Whittlesea is not that big, but we go through that source, transfer, and deposition zone very quickly here, and then have these different groundwater interactions along the way. A couple slides here to finish up over in the driftless area. So we tend to have these steep headwaters in the driftless area, so not so much of the wetlands headwaters that we see in some of the other parts of the state. And Pleasant Valley's got a lot of spring flow though. Once you get down, you can see how deep it is. And you can't really see the banks, but highly vegetated, clear flow. And so this is kind of more of the setting, we have this almost kind of buried karst-like landscape. So it's another way of getting springs that, come out differently, differentially in places. So that's, some streams are groundwater fed and others not so much, and they can be pretty close to each other as well, even though we have this kind of older landscape. So here's an example of Big Springs branch where, here's the spring coming down, it's bedrock. So It's not like entrenched or anything. It's like, kind of at the surface, and then you get these wide valley bottoms with the cold water streams flowing in them. So question 2, I think. So we got the pop-up there, and see how this looks. So we have these 4 stream settings, and then 4 questions to go with that, which is the most bedrock dominated. So can you kind of see where those drivers, it's kind of give you see what you think about the drivers, and if you can tell them from these photos.
Okay, we're going to leave that poll open for a few more moments because people are still responding, but Faith, you can go ahead and move on to your next slide.
Do you want me to give the answers to those or not?
Oh, that might be nice. So, sorry, Al. No learning here.
Just think about it.
Yeah, I think, Emily, it looks like we've slowed down a little bit. So why don't we go ahead and share the results?
Sure. So it's like, which one is most dominated by bedrock? So like what my indicator's looking at, what do you see these big boulders here, right? So, and then this is boulder here as well. Some of it may be bedrock, or maybe boulders like right on the surface of bedrock. So the answer is Trout Brook, and so that's up in the kind of by Mellon, kind of coming out of the Pinocchio range. Which one is actively meandering? Actually, I see there could be 2 in this one, just by looking at the sediment. The answer was 1, Whittlesea Creek. You can see the sediment moving around. It's got eroding banks on the outside of the bends, and then kind of a little bit discontinuous, but the point bar deposits as well. This one maybe is trying to do that a little bit. But which one is most dominated by vegetation control? So if we look at this Beaver Dam River area, I think this was in that Waterloo wetland complex there. Geology, not so much. We're in this kind of bead area for the Beaver Dam River. This is another one which goes upstream. You get into those drumlins, and there's also some sinuosity that's related to those drumlin features too, and it's very narrow. So that's the vegetation one. And then the last one was, which one has a confined valley? So we have that steep source zone that we were talking about. And that's this one, Troutmere Creek. It's got springs that also come into it, but it's got the steeper valley sides that you can see, at least on this side. Okay. So that's the answers to those. Hopefully you can kind of see those features in there. Again, I know it's like, what you can get out of a picture instead of standing stream side. So hopefully this helps with showing some of the range of how those drivers work in the Wisconsin setting, both in the headwaters and in the depositional zone. So the places where the headwaters, we don't really have floodplains, they're lowlands, a lot of connection to wetlands if we have those flat landscapes between those depositional glacial landforms. And we can have groundwater interactions spaced sporadically along those longitudinal profiles and those source to transfer to depositional zones that we see in that longitudinal connectivity. Maybe something like that was helpful is you might have meanders and sinuosity, but they're not always related to floods and flood flows and floodplains and laterally migrating meandering river systems. It generally takes slopes about 1% to 2% to get into that type of energy that's necessary to have those laterally migrating meanders. So a lot of the headwater wetland in those flatter zones, they'll have slopes that are like less than 0.5%, 0.3, 0.1% slope, if any. Those hyporheic zones can be really interwoven with local, regional, alluvial aquifers. That base flow in streams represents the groundwater table, and it can fluctuate on how it's connected longitudinally. And just getting started, there's some visual indicators that we can start to use to help us kind of understand which are maybe the major drivers and what that relation might be between groundwater and flood flows helping to form the stream character. So that's some of the major concepts. So I think I'll turn it back over to you, Erin. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Faith. That was really a tremendous amount of wonderful information. And we still have some time for Q&A, but we have a little bit of housekeeping to do first. So I'd like to invite folks to please start entering questions into the chat for either Faith or Nelson. I need to share my screen for just like a teeny little bit of housekeeping. And then we have one more final exercise as well, but we'll move through that really quickly. So I am looking for my slides, and of course, I'm having trouble finding them. Here we go. So, as we mentioned, this is a training series, so I think probably many on this call. Are you all seeing that? Are you seeing my save the date slide? Okay, I'll just do it verbally. We're going to be at Wisconsin Land and Water with a technical roundtable using a watershed perspective to assess hydrologic restoration opportunities. Kyle McGarrah from our staff and Stephanie Rockwood, our geospatial analyst, are going to be facilitating and leading a lot of that session along with Bart Chapman from DADCAP. Post survey, as soon as you click out of here, there's going to be an evaluation survey that we'll launch, and we'd really, really appreciate your feedback on what we did, how we could do better, what else you'd like to learn about. It really helps inform future efforts. And again, thank you to DADCAP, EPA, Wisconsin Land and Water, and most of all, Nelson Ham and Faith Fitzpatrick for all of the hard work they put into making this beautiful program. Okay, so let me stop sharing. We're going to very, very quickly, while we wait for your questions to come in on the chat, do a final meeting reflection. This is on a whiteboard, if you'd pull that up, Emily. We'd like you to answer 2 questions. What did you learn today that was new to you that felt particularly important to your work? There's a lot to choose from, of course, as well as how might you apply what you learned in this segment to your work? So if you haven't used a whiteboard, you literally just click the text feature on the left, the little pencil, you make a little box and you type, and it'll be small, but we'll be able to increase it in size and show it later on. Meanwhile, if you also would like to put some questions in the chat, maybe Nelson and Faith can start reviewing those, because in about a minute or 2, we can leave this whiteboard up and also start taking questions. So not to be schizophrenic, but I want to make sure we really get both activities in, because people have been waiting a long time to ask their questions. So let's give it a quiet minute or 2, and then we'll go to Q&A. And Okay, we're going to leave this whiteboard up, but maybe another 30 seconds of quiet time. You all are a little bit of a shy group. I don't see any questions yet in the chat, and I'm sure there are some. So please, please step up. Okay, let's leave the whiteboard up, but I'm gonna kick off with a question that came from the room. One of the things that was actually pretty new to many of our staff was the fact that the groundwater springs can be a driver for meander belts in certain settings. And Faith, I wonder if you could say a little more, please, about the mechanism behind that.
Sure. Yeah, it is kind of an interesting thing because we're so ingrained in thinking of the meanders formed from the stream moving back and forth across that meander belt, and the meander belt is the way that you figure like how wide it is. You can kind of see it where the river has been. And again, you have the sedimentary deposits that go with that are kind of showing that migration. That belt width is dependent on the flood hydrology as you go, have a river that's big enough to have that. So we see like all these kind of arcuate shapes that are very similar to that in the lowlands, and they're basically, if you start to look at them, they're kind of like connecting where you have these springs that are, it's not all coming in at the same place in the same amount. So that those springs, some of them might even be tributaries too, small tributaries coming in that help form, and it's like connecting the dots then between those. And then any beaver activity too, that's the other thing. Like we talked about vegetation, I didn't really talk about beavers in this, but those are where the biological actions can really show up and control that.
Great, thank you so much. Still not seeing any questions in the chat other than will the session be recorded and posted? And yes, the answer is it will through Wisconsin Land and Water. So I'll throw out another kind of generic question while we're waiting. And I think we could probably pull the whiteboard so we can see Faith and Nelson's faces a little larger. Oh, we got one. Can we have a quick discussion of loess soils? I don't know if I've pronounced that correctly. I know I've heard the word and I forget how to say it.
Sure. Do you want me to say something real quick?
Sure.
So one of the things that it's just a matter of time really cover is, for example, in the driftless area, I think I tried to make the point that there are no glacial deposits left behind by the glacier actually overriding that region, but there are glacially associated deposits in other parts of Wisconsin, including the driftless area. And loess is basically a wind-blown silt that largely, in our case, came from winds blowing across big meltwater rivers of sand and gravel that were in the Mississippi River Valley when the glacier was still here in the upper Midwest. And the silt from that sand and gravel, so there's sand and gravel that dominates, and then there's some sand and silt. The silt is typically what can be blown over a fairly long distance in the air. Sand stays when it moves close to the ground and forms dunes. So there's soil scientists are well aware in the upper Midwest, all the way down the Mississippi River Valley, that predominantly on the east side of the Mississippi Valley, but also in the west, the landscape is covered with anywhere from several inches to several feet or a couple of tens of feet in other places of this windblown silt. And it is an important factor to consider when you're thinking about infiltration rates in groundwater in places where it's thick. It's even in the inland parts of Wisconsin, like in my area, a few inches of silt is not uncommon that you can make out as being loess. In southwest Wisconsin, if you're really close to the Mississippi River, it can be several feet easily.
Thank you. Seeing no other questions, I'll throw out another one that you guys can decide who goes first. So you presented so much great information, and you both have such vast expertise, and you shared a lot of really good resources. I know you both also work quite frequently with county land conservation departments. And so I wonder if you could offer a takeaway of, sort of sifting and winnowing through all of the things that you shared. What would you key in on as like a place to start, maybe sort of a common area where some of these resources are maybe really useful, available, and pretty underutilized, but are also not something that takes your PhDs and your 35 years of experience to use? Just that.
I didn't put in the soil surveys, like the Surgo data in any of my talk, but that is such a good scale to kind of get a feel for like what's going on with the stratigraphy and where you might have those varying deposits that would affect how groundwater is going to interact with the valley or the stream. And then the other thing that I didn't mention too, but like with a lot of restoration projects, there's the stream restoration projects there, and probably wetland too, that there are geologic, there's cores taken to determine if there's like contaminants or what the contaminants levels are. Those also have the textures with them, and they tend to like line and cross cut whatever restoration is happening too. They also have, so they have the textures, you can see where the gravels are, and then also what the water table differences are too. So it helps to like concentrate if you want to get the best bang for like a spring coming in, or a gravel unit that's going to be carrying more potential base flow into that stream. That'll be a little cold pocket and a warm pocket during the winter, kind of thing. So you get that out of some of the stuff that's done with the soil borings that might not make it into like a restoration design, because it's kind of set up to do the background stuff instead of like feed into a design, so yeah.
What I would add just really quickly is, from the standpoint of some of the things that I talked about, the State Geological Survey in Madison over the last 50 years has really produced a lot of very useful material on the ice age geology of the state, and to a lesser extent on the bedrock geology. And there are multiple geologists there who are just waiting to answer questions. That's their job, and they're phenomenal at it when you're looking for help or resources. And the other thing I would say is, spread around the state are the USGS office, for example, in Madison, and almost at all the major universities and even some of the colleges, there are faculty who do know the regional geology usually really well, and I think universally are also willing to answer questions and help. I would never be shy of doing that at all. And I've never heard of a case where someone simply says, "Why, I'm not going to help you." That's just not, I think, the nature of people that work in this field, is take advantage of local resources as much as you can, as well as the survey.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So we are out of time, but I'll just ask one easy softball question. There was a request for clarification. The less soils, because they're finer, does that impede infiltration then, because they sort of sit tighter?
No, that's a good question. It does have reduced infiltration relative to, say, a sand and gravel, and the great example of that in the state is the Antigo Flats in Langley County, which of course most of you might know is our big potato growing region, right? Historically. And the state soil, which probably all of you know, is the Antigo silt loam. It is a soil of sand and gravel covered by a foot or two, in some cases 6 inches at least, of loess in that region. And one of the reasons that it can be a particularly good agricultural soil is the silt will hold water longer than if it was just sand and gravel up to the surface. So if you kind of compare that to the central sands of Glacial Lake, Wisconsin, The reason irrigation is so prominent there is the water infiltrates into those soils very quickly. So they get very dry. Again, after precipitation events, the loess will hold some of that moisture and allows certain kinds of agriculture without having to irrigate.
Thank you so much for the clarification, and thank you all for spilling over a couple of minutes. We had a great time today and are grateful for all the information. Our recording will be posted. You'll be getting a post webinar survey momentarily, and we hope to see all or many of you at Wisconsin Land and Water, and we'll be in touch soon about the series as it continues later this spring. Thanks all.